as well as in setting up SBU, single business units, in our own right. And we have had encouraging or continuing management and advisory services engagement with a commercial bank. With a commercial bank, and Mr. Stanislao had indeed shared in the bounty of such efforts. We have had shared so many other fun and amusing memories, and too much laughter with him during his and our colleagues' birthdays, visitation to his and my family farms, small reunions, and during wakes of our former colleagues who went ahead of us. As the saying goes, all good things will come to an end. And Mr. Stanislao has gone ahead of us. Most of us, senior citizens, are also in our own respective pre-departure areas. So we will surely meet Mr. Stanislao again in the next slide after that. Mr. Stanislao, sirs, you have lived your life within the shibboleths of duty, well performed, honor and integrity, untarnished and well preserved, and country and small farmers above yourself. We come to say goodbye and render you our last respect and salute, sir. Thank you and good night.
This lady joined the bank as Assistant Vice President of the Projects and Acquired Assets Department. She rose and eventually became the Senior Vice President of the banking sector. She left the bank to transfer to the Filipinas Bank as its EVP, and eventually she became the President and CEO of the Development Bank of the Philippines. Let us now listen to Mrs. Remedios L. Macalinca.
Good evening to the family of Mr. Stanislao, to my colleagues, to all land bankers, both present and past, and to our friends, Mr. Estan, and to the friends of President Stanislao who are here. I will not say many things. It's very late. I'm sure you all want to have your proper dinner. I worked with Mr. Stanislao at Land Bank for 13 years, from 1973 until his retirement in 1986. And like everyone here, I am saddened by his passing. He was our pioneering and hardworking president with an unblemished record of public service, known for his honesty and integrity and a genuine concern for the farmers, the constituents he served with passion as president of Land Bank. But more than that, we remember him for his humility, for having been a mentor to many of us in the bank, and a true gentleman of the finest tradition. I first met Mr. Stan when he interviewed me when I was applying for the position of bank examiner at the central bank. He was then a high-ranking official of the central bank, superintendent of banks, and was already known for his honesty and fairness as a bank regulator. I was then a fresh graduate who just passed the CPA examinations. Mr. Stan was so different from the others who interviewed me. He was quite good-looking, tall and slim, and young. He was young then. But what struck me most about him was his humility. He was so humble, and he talked to me as his equal, and not as a high central bank official interviewing a job applicant for an entry-level position. 16 years later, I was again interviewed by Mr. Stan. This time, he was the newly appointed president of Land Bank, and I was being considered for an officer position in the bank. He was the same humble and amiable man, and he was full of plans even as early as that. He was full of plans of what he wanted to do, particularly for the farmer beneficiaries to make them productive, and for the landowners who would be losing their land. He also talked of profitability and growth of the bank as a universal bank, to be able to finance the huge requirements of agrarian reform. I recall the very early days when we were struggling and trying hard in getting land banks started on both the agrarian side and the banking side. On the banking side, we were drafting and stenciling. Yes, we were stenciling because there were no computers then. Loan application forms, promissory notes, credit policies and procedures, and countless other tasks involved in starting deposit and loan operations. Our office was a very small, cramped space at the Ramon Magsaysay Center along Rojas Boulevard. In the first few months, there were about 8 of us sharing 3 tables and a few chairs and 1 old typewriter. But we managed to get the work done, imbued with the dream and vision that years later, Land Bank would succeed in its efforts to uplift the welfare of the farmers at the same time that the bank would grow and become a major player in the banking industry. Mr. Stanislaw worked with us up to the late hours of the night, sometimes well past midnight, giving us words of wisdom and encouragement and sharing with us his rich experiences as a bank regulator. As we all know, Mr. Stanislaw managed the bank with integrity and judiciousness. During his term, Land Bank did not give any special favors to friends nor cronies, nor did it have behest loans, unlike 2 other government institutions which had to be bailed out and rehabilitated because of behest loans. Of course, we were very fortunate that Land Bank had a board of directors headed by Prime Minister Virata, who shared with management the same values of integrity and probity. Mr. Stan was also very prudent with the use of the bank's funds. Besides very prudent lending, he never tolerated extravagance in any of the bank's activities like opening of branches and field offices or planning conferences. He was a very simple man with simple tastes and did not want any special attention or special privileges to be given to him. Jess was right. He did not want any bands or streamers whenever he arrived in the branches to be opened or inaugurated. But it was not all work with Mr. Stan. We also had some fun activities. In the early years of the bank, we held our planning conferences at the Development Academy of the Philippines. It was cost-effective to hold it there. After the serious business of planning, Mr. Stan would always find time to cook for us his signature dish, the bulalo. We remember that bulalo. For some time, when we were still very few in the bank, we would always look forward to Mr. Stan's to die for bulalo. Occasionally, this was long before we were eating in the Chinese restaurants. He would invite us to the Three Sisters. That is a tiny restaurant in Cavite. There was no traffic then. And we feasted on his favorite oysters, prawns, crabs, and of course, the ever-present bulalo. We also enjoyed our annual picnics to celebrate his birthday at Dr. Reyes Fish Pond in Malolos, Bulacan, and after Mr. Stan's retirement, at his farm in Calamba, Laguna. In later years, after most of our original group had left Land Bank, he was very proud of what we had become after Land Bank. Mr. Stan, you will forever remain in our thoughts. We will always remember you, not only because you exemplified honest and dedicated public service, but because you were a caring mentor and friend to all of us who had the privilege of working with you.
The next speaker started as special assistant to Mr. Stanislao, and eventually he was made to head the corporate planning department early in 1974. He has held various leadership positions, such as being president of Pilipinas Bank and later on as president CEO of the UCPB. Friends, let us listen to Mr. Tirso D. Antiporda Jr.
I guess I have the privilege of speaking longer than the others. Anyway, greetings to the family of our beloved friend, Basilio Stanislao. We are all here today to honor a dear and beloved friend, Mr. Stanislao. He was truly a very special person. He was brilliant, he was competent, and he was a very humble person. He was very hardworking and dedicated to the bank, yet very compassionate to his staff. He was fair, he was humorous, he was always fun to be with, whether at play or at work. And there's really a lot to love about the man. But most important of all, he was an honest man. He was a person you can trust to always do the right thing, all of the time. In those early years of the revitalized land bank, he was the glue that held everyone together. He was the perfect boss. But to me personally, Mr. Stanislao was more than just a boss. He was like a second father. In fact, I was just 26 years old when I joined the bank in 1973 and met Mr. Stanislao for the first time. I had no real experience in banking. Everything I knew about banking was purely theoretical, straight out of graduate school. Sure, I knew all the theory, but had no real world experience in banking. Yet Stan, who perhaps already had 30 years of banking experience at that time, trusted me with much greater responsibilities than my years and experience actually deserved. At that time, as a young man, it was an awesome feeling. It was amazing. It almost felt to me like he just handed me a ball and said, go play with it. And I did. And since Stan was also a bit of a slave driver, I ended up working like a horse. I became so driven to perform well, and perhaps most of the people around me thought I was driven by personal ambition. But the truth is, the reason I was so driven to perform and work so hard was because I hated to disappoint Mr. Stanislao. I had such admiration and affection for the man that disappointing him was simply unacceptable. And of course, he rewarded me for all the hard work. After only 6 months in the bank, he promoted me 3 ranks up to become manager of the corporate planning department. And then he kept promoting me almost every other year, as if on schedule. That's a little worrisome because when Jess was saying that some people waited 6 years to get promoted in the bank, it certainly amazes me that nobody protested about my constant promotion every other year. But he did give me my first break in the banking business, and honestly, I literally owe my career to him. I'm sure Mr. Stanislao has touched the lives of a lot of people, and I'm also sure that each of us has many interesting stories to tell about him. But if you don't mind, I would like to share one of my own, because this story captures how I truly feel about the man. Not very many people know this, but I almost did not get hired into the land bank because of Mr. Stanislao himself. The person who was recruiting me into the bank was actually Mr. Sunday Lavin, then head of the field operations department, and who was also my boss at the PDIC before I left PDIC to become part of Del Monte. So he was trying to recruit me, but there was a problem because Mr. Stanislao was also trying to hire my father, who was his subordinate at the central bank. In fact, at that time, my father was already doing some work for Stan in the land bank on loan from the central bank. Obviously, my father and I cannot both be working in the same bank because it would have been very awkward, and it would have smacked of nepotism. So Mr. Lavin, who I guess really wanted me to join his team, decided to talk to my father about his desire to recruit me. This made my father change his mind about joining the land bank. There was, of course, the sensitive matter of having to inform Mr. Stanislao about this change of heart, considering that he had already committed much earlier to Mr. Stanislao to join the land bank. Thus, one day, when my father and Mr. Stanislao were both in the washroom at the Ramon Magsaysay Center, my dad brought up the matter. Why in heaven's name my father decided to take up an important and sensitive personal matter with the president of the bank in a comfort room still puzzles me to this day. But I never sought an explanation. Anyway, after my father informed Stan of his decision to stay in the central bank, Mr. Stanislao sternly told my father, "You know, Auntie," that was my father's nickname, Auntie. Said, "You know, Auntie, a man creates his own destiny. You are now facing a fork in the road, and you are walking away from your destiny. You are choosing the wrong fork." Obviously, my dad was Mr. Stanislao's first choice. I only won the land bank job by default because my father walked away. I could not have been here at all. I would now like to fast forward 10 years. And 10 years later, by then I was 36 years old and had just been appointed president of Pilipinas Bank, 3 years after I left the land bank. In celebration, my father and I invited Mr. Stanislao to play tennis with us at the Quezon City Sports Club. And after an hour of tennis, which Mr. Stan won, by the way, or maybe I should say I allowed him to win. He was my boss after all. After an hour of tennis, we had a leisurely breakfast. And out of the blue, Mr. Stanislao reminisced about the old times and recalled to my father the circumstances about my hiring. He said, "You know, Auntie, hiring June was not really my first choice. I wanted you. But it turns out that by hiring June instead of you, the bank made a much better deal." And he started laughing out loud.